Hello and welcome to GBD and today's real trade policy conversation over an imaginary cup of tea. The tea can be anywhere, Boston to Beijing, from char to chai. I'm Judge Morris with the Global Business Dialogue, and with me is John Magnus, founder and president of TradeWins LLC. A graduate of Stanford with a law degree from University of Chicago, John's been working in trade policy for more than 30 years. He was a partner at Dewey Ballantine in 2004 when he left to form TradeWins. The firm is a law and policy consulting firm with headquarters in Washington, D.C. And over the years, John's been involved in just about every kind of trade case: anti-dumping, countervailing duties, 301, WTO disputes. That work's given him an expert's view on several sectors: steel, solar panels, aerospace, textiles and apparel, home appliances, livestock. That's just a few of them. The TradeWins website tells us that the firm delivers answers. It delivers timely reporting through analysis and sound advice. It delivers wins. But yes, there's more. John wears a number of hats. He's an adjunct professor at American University's Washington College of Law, and he's also the current chairman of GBD's Board of Advisors. We're lucky to have him. He's one of the most astute analysts of global trade policy and policy developments in Washington, or for that matter, anywhere. So John, thanks for doing this, and let's get into it. The eternal question is, what's next? And that's especially true now, as everybody wants to know or is anxious to learn who will win the US presidential election. And what would a Biden or a Trump victory mean for US trade policy? I suggest we leave those questions till later, but let's begin with some of the issues that either Biden or Trump will need to confront, and questions which I know you've been following for a long time, starting, of course, with the WTO. We could do a whole session on the WTO. We don't have time for that, but we can hit some of the most glaring issues, starting with the dispute settlement system. The appellate body is no longer functioning, and so in that sense, the system is broken. That leads to a series of questions, the first of which is, what happened? Why did the United States begin the process of not approving appellate body members?
Thank you, Judge. And it's an honor to participate in this interview. And I guess it makes sense to say at the outset that what you're going to hear are personal views, not client views. The standard disclaimer. I would say the WTO dispute settlement system was malfunctioning well before the United States stopped approving new appellate body members. And that malfunctioning is the reason why the United States stopped approving new appellate body members. The dissatisfaction goes back a long way, and it's never been entirely focused on the appellate body part of dispute settlement. Focusing on the appellate body in terms of what the United States is doing right now made sense, and the appellate body itself made some particularly egregious errors that sort of invited this focus. But the dissatisfaction with what the dispute settlement system is producing and how it's been operating resides at both levels and goes back quite a long way. And it also extends to the behavior of the WTO members in terms of how they use dispute settlement. So, the pattern that emerged and that motivated the United States started with cases that shouldn't have been filed, and that once filed shouldn't have succeeded but did, through decisions that creatively rewrote and I guess if you wanted to be generous, you could say filled gaps in the WTO rulebook in a way that always turned out and always does turn out to favor complainants. It was a dynamic that was already very bad, and it was worsening, and it was becoming increasingly clear that that dynamic was very relevant to the emerging huge trade problem that the United States and others have in regard to their trade relations with China. And so the United States, I think, United States government recognized that filling the appellate body or refilling the appellate body was one of the many things that happens in the WTO that requires consensus. that by staying out of a consensus on new appointments, the United States might be able to get some attention to a problem that it had been complaining about as loudly as possible and was nevertheless failing to garner attention over a period of many years, really going back to the time when the WTO dispute settlement system started operating in the middle 1990s.
Okay, so what should be done? Are there steps the WTO could take that would make the system work better? And more fundamentally, are there must-do corrections, steps that would need to be taken to bring the United States back on board as a strong supporter of the WTO dispute settlement system?
I think that's a good way to frame it. The must-do changes, I think, unfortunately, are more numerous than many commentators have suggested that they are. There's been quite a bit of public commentary suggesting that, well, if we only did A, B, and C, we could restart dispute settlement. And I don't agree with that. I don't believe that that's accurate at all. It's a particularly difficult problem, Judge, because of one of the characteristics of WTO dispute settlement, which is who's involved with it. And the people who are involved with it are people who work in and around the WTO and who believe in the WTO and want it to have the biggest footprint that it can have. And I think what exists in that ecosystem is a view that, somehow if a defendant wins, it means the WTO loses. If a case features behavior that people don't like and they can't find a rule in the WTO rule book that actually applies to it, and they have to say, well, this kind of stinks, but there's nothing we can do because there's been no explicit promise not to behave this way. It doesn't just feel like a loss for the complainant, it feels like a loss for the WTO. The WTO winds up with a smaller footprint. And the people whose professional lives are bound up in the WTO fundamentally don't want that. And so it drives for understandable human reasons, it drives the people who participate in WTO adjudication to work like mad to find some rule that they can stretch to cover any behavior they don't like. And thereby invariably, and it is just about invariably, rule for the complainant. So trying to solve a problem like that is awfully difficult. My view is that the must-haves, one thing includes this very idea of recommitting. The members need to recommit to the basic international law principle. There's a Latin version of this called in dubio mitius. It means that sovereigns can only be faulted when they do something that they have expressly promised they wouldn't do. And so that concept is in the system already, but it is not even honored in the breach. And so I think the provisions of the dispute settlement understanding, particularly those that reference the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, et cetera, need an update in this particular respect. So that's one thing on the must-have list. Second thing I would say, the problem goes beyond simply putting new words on paper and hoping that the results will be different this time. So I don't see that as by itself sufficient. In my view, there are some past cases that are going to have to be repudiated, and basically the wrongful winnings disgorged. That's going to be very unpleasant for the WTO members who brought those cases to basically acknowledge that they shouldn't have won and that the core holding of those cases is invalid going forward. I think we're going to have to see that as part of any kind of a package that brings the United States back into joining consensuses on things like stocking the appellate body. And then I think the third thing that's a must-have is a new and reinvigorated set of rules to keep cases that shouldn't be litigated from being litigated. They keep certain categories of cases out of the system entirely. And the idea there is that a system that does less will have fewer opportunities to offend us. There were many rules built into the Uruguay round package that were designed to do that, and they've not been followed either. It's sort of open season instead of sort of a managed flow of cases that can get into the system. And so I think that those sort of case management rules are going to need another look, and I put that in the must-have category.
Okay.
on the should do's, I guess
Yeah.
I'll just add those. You know, there's a long list of things you could do to improve the system. I would, I guess, suggest focusing on a couple of them. One is who can serve as a panelist. In my view, it should not be possible for incumbent officials of government members of the WTO to serve as panelists. That's based on a fiction that is less and less useful as a fiction as we go forward. The idea that people who become panelists become independent and serve independently and can sort of compartmentalize and forget who writes their paycheck every 2 weeks and judge impartially in these cases. I don't see it that way, and you wind up with a lot of situations that are not technically, you know, precluded or viewed as a conflict because they don't hail from one of the disputing members, but absolutely their government, who writes their paycheck every 2 weeks, has a view about what's the better outcome of the case and what they want to be the outcome of the case. And so I think that's corrosive, and it isn't necessary that incumbent government officials serve as panelists. I would also structurally separate the appellate body staff from the WTO Secretariat so that it's very clear that they're not part of the same personnel system and that they report to the sitting appellate body members. If we're going to have a second tier in an appellate body, the staff should not be comprised of people who, for all intents and purposes, are just secretariat officials like any other secretariat officials. That's not really an independent appellate body, in my view. And then the last thing is I'd open the rooms up. I think we're sort of, you know, past the era where if there are, you know, if you want the results of WTO dispute settlement to be treated like they amount to adjudication, then they should occur in full public view. And so the idea that you know, only some meetings of panels or appellate body divisions are viewable, and only through closed circuit if you go, you know, to Geneva and sit in the WTO building and peer into a little screen. I think the time for that is long since passed, and the credibility of the system can be restored best, perhaps only, in an environment of transparency.
That's really helpful, John. But I just have one last question on this appellate body thing. And it's kind of a big one. It's, does the system really need an appellate body?
It needs a dispute settlement mechanism. It needs a neutral third-party dispute settlement mechanism. That mechanism doesn't have to have 2 tiers, in my opinion. Nor does it necessarily need to have automatic adoption. You know, what we've lost in this current chapter, not so much that we've lost the appellate body, but by losing the appellate body, we've lost automatic adoption as well. Meaning that the results of a dispute settlement proceeding can be made unadoptable by the dispute settlement body if you simply file an appeal into the void. And so in that sense, for this current crop of disputes, we're back into the GATT era with no automatic adoption. And I think the question is, you know, do we miss automatic adoption? Should we miss it? I'm not so sure. If you're going to have it, then I think it's useful to also have an appellate body. It's good for those 2 things to be paired with each other. But the system can work without those. And I think you've seen some of the commentary, both from the scholarly world and from U.S. government officials, starting to point out that, you know, there is nothing actually sacrosanct about either automatic adoption or having a 2-tiered system. The key thing, I think, is that the system needs to be used responsibly. And it has been used very irresponsibly, I think, over time. And this criticism that one of the criticisms that the U.S. government makes that I think is particularly valid and accurate is this criticism about other WTO members using litigation to pursue what they pursued and failed to get in negotiation, and as a substitute for negotiation. And that version of you know, shared membership in the WTO is not appealing, and it doesn't lead anywhere good.
That too is helpful. Now we talked a little bit about personnel in the dispute settlement system, but let's go to the sort of the top of the WTO personnel matter. As you know, the last Director General, Roberto Azevedo of Brazil, stepped down at the end of August, and the WTO is now deep into the process of selecting his successor. At this point, there are just two remaining candidates, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala of Nigeria and Minister Yu Myung-lee from South Korea. The final selection will be made in the next couple of weeks. They're both strong candidates, and I wouldn't ask you to pick between them, but there are background questions or criteria where I think I really would like to know what your thoughts are. Among these is that of geography. Should it really matter whether the WTO Director General comes from a developed or a developing country, or for that matter, which continent he or she hails from? Also, there's the matter of gender. Both of the remaining candidates are women, and so at least for this DG, that issue settled. The next DG will be a woman. But how large a role should gender play in the selection of future WTO Directors General?
So I'll start with geography, Judge, and there I think there's something pretty unfortunate that has been occurring during this particular campaign. You know, countries don't lead the WTO Secretariat. Individual humans do. And when you associate a candidate for a post like that with that candidate's country of citizenship or with some geography, Africa or East Asia or Global South or Latin America or whatever, then what you're suggesting is that there's going to be some particularly strong connection during the period of service that might occur, as if this were somehow like a representative function. And it isn't. This is not like electing a member of Congress or Parliament. That's not what it is at all. The WTO needs great leaders. The Secretariat needs great leaders. And so I think it's corrosive to, you know, and I can't tell you how many pieces I've read about, oh, there's the British candidate or the Egyptian candidate or whatever, in a way that really plays up their supposed affinity for the views and interests of one particular sponsoring country, and really plays down their individual leadership capabilities and achievements and fitness for the job in every other way. And I look at it the opposite of that. I think that idea is corrosive, and I don't understand why we speak about candidates the way we do. If you do want to emphasize geography, and I don't, but then I would say you should essentially have a preference for countries that trade a lot in the WTO, and so that, I guess, is a comment that would tend to point toward one rather than the other of the finalists that we have here. But you know, I don't think that geography is the right way to think about this. I don't think that it's a representative function. And you know, on gender, you know, leadership is the filter. Leadership, leadership, and leadership. And I don't think that's a filter that discriminates. And from where I sit, the trade world is teeming with supremely effective women leaders. And so I don't know that you really need to consciously attach yourself to a criterion other than leadership in order to get great results. You know, and I'll just point this out, a historical note. When I started working in the trade field, I can't think of a single important position in the U.S. government for trade that wasn't at that moment, and this was in 1990, at that moment occupied by a woman. Chief trade counsels at the two congressional committees of jurisdiction, ITC chair, USTR, Secretary of Commerce, on and on and on and on and on. And so I sort of left law school and, you know, wandered into what felt to me at the time like a a part of the professional world where it was really led in every important respect, at least in terms of government service and policy making responsibility, by great women leaders. And that's what I've seen ever since. So, and I'm not surprised that this election result has, or that this selection process for the DG has sort of evolved in the way that it has. But I don't see that as somehow, in my mind, it's not connected with anything that looks like affirmative action. It's about great leaders stepping up to take on an important job.
Okay, so now let's move on to what the WTO sort of does. The larger question of the role it plays in an evolving world. The world has been evolving quite rapidly in the last few years. I'm simplifying, I realize that, John, but in the GATT years, for example, virtually every member faced the same tariffs as every other member vis-a-vis a third country. That's no longer the case. The explosion of bilateral and regional FTAs in the interim has created a very different landscape. On the other hand, as the UK's departure from the EU suggests, it still is useful to have a safety net of agreed rules, even if the so-called most favored nation tariff rates are no longer the best thing on offer. The larger questions are, what is the best way of understanding the mission of the WTO in the middle of the 21st century?
Well, I can tell you, where I see great value in it, it's a place to solve problems. The way in which countries use WTO membership to curb their worst impulses is, I think, very powerful still today. And it's especially visible in the context of countries that are acceding to the WTO. I say countries, I guess it could include customs territories, and who use the accession process as a driver of the reforms they want to make, but maybe their politics aren't quite up to the task of producing those sensible results in the absence of something like the imperative of conforming to WTO rules. But I believe that part of the dynamic is still super important. And then it's a place where the members can effectively urge each other forward to, even if they aren't negotiating new agreements, to have sound and trade-friendly policies through the notification and surveillance processes and the committee work and so forth, and so that little problems don't grow up to be big problems, right? So some country puts in place I don't know, let's say a food labeling scheme that is really hateful from the point of view of discrimination and consistency with WTO rules and so forth. And it comes up and is able to be discussed in the first instance in the TBT committee or the SPS committee or something. And through that regular work, out of the limelight work in the committee process, maybe the discussion advances and a constructive solution is found, and a dispute doesn't have to happen, right? I would say the WTO operating at its best does a really good job at preventing disputes from ripening, even if there are reasons to be concerned about what happens when disputes do ripen and do blow up. So that I think is it's a place to solve problems more than anything. It's not the UN General Assembly. We have one of those. It's not supposed to be that.
Okay, I'm returning to one of the areas that's really critical, which is subsidies. It's sort of at the heart of a lot of the more vexing challenges in trade. Aircraft, Brexit, agriculture, China. How effective can the WTO be in disciplining subsidies?
So the members, through the subsidy control mechanisms that we have kept something of a lid on subsidies reasonably well over 25 years. It's certainly not perfect, and there's a great sadness for me in that the subsidy control rules that we have in the WTO are no longer as good as they were when we put them in place. They've been sort of shredded through the dispute settlement process. Maybe I'll come back to that in a second. But overall, if you look at what's happened, across various areas, and you see some bulges that occur when there's a Great Recession or when there's a pandemic or something. You see these kind of temporary bulges of public spending. But overall, I think the WTO has done a decent job. It's one of the hardest areas, precisely because it's sort of it's a core sovereign prerogative for members, right, to spend money in the way that makes sense to them. And so, the disciplines up to now that we've put in place at the WTO are not that tight. The basic rule in the WTO on subsidies is don't use export contingent subsidies, don't use import substitution subsidies. Otherwise, use all the subsidies you want, just don't hurt anybody. That's not a terribly, tight lacing of the shoes. In agriculture, you have, of course, a separate complementary set of controls that are numerical controls based on the color-coded boxes, right? So in addition to not causing anyone serious prejudice, in addition to not using export subsidies, you also can't spend more than X on blue subsidies and Y on green subsidies and Q on yellow subsidies. So that is, I think, helpful too. In the aggregate, it's modestly effective, and that's better than nothing. But it would be considerably better than nothing if we hadn't done so much violence to the subsidies agreement in the dispute settlement process. And there I'm thinking about the decisions that have come out on things like continuing benefit and things like entrusts or directs, indirect subsidies, things like public body. There's been a series of rules, and the unifying theme in all those decisions is that it was necessary to rule against American countervailing duty measures. But what you got as a result is a significant paring back of the legal definition of a subsidy in the subsidies agreement, and it's now not good enough. It was barely good enough after the Uruguay round, and now it's not good enough. And so now you see, Japan and the United States and I guess the EU trying to come up with some sort of an idea for, improving the subsidies agreement. But, if we just started by essentially, overruling those crazy decisions, we'd have a pretty good subsidies agreement already.
That's I'm really glad I asked the question, John. That's very good. To go back a little bit to the dispute settlement issue, the question I didn't ask before and would like to ask now is it really necessary and desirable for all the disputes, trade disputes, to go through the WTO? Currently, for example, the US-China relationship is being handled largely outside the WTO. So the question then arises, should the system recognize that there will be occasions when it's better for all if parties to a dispute find their own solution, not necessarily involving the WTO? So
I can't resist in answering that, Judge. I can't resist pointing out that the 301 case, the US-China situation is not the only one that's been taken outside the boundaries. Every WTO member that hauled off and retaliated against the 232 tariffs in effect, was taking that whole set of issues outside of the WTO and turning it into a bilateral thing instead of using the WTO to complain about the 232 tariffs. So we're having sort of, I just, to help my students understand, you know, what's going on between China and the United States, I tell them it's, you know, it's kind of like there's a cocktail party and a fight breaks out between two attendees and they take it out to the parking lot instead of fighting inside the house where they can break things. The United States and China right now are fighting in the parking lot, but the United States is also fighting with others in the parking lot who took fights outside the system. It's not just the China thing. Is that something to regret? I mean, look, first of all, a system that really in some enforceable way tried to prevent parking lot fights, it's not a system anybody would want to belong to. The United States wouldn't want to belong to that system. I don't think anybody would. And, you know, just as you can always choose to violate your WTO obligations at any moment with respect to any other member, you know, you can choose to handle a problem bilaterally. And when you do that, you may be wronging the other party in the bilateral equation, but are you harming everybody else? Do we have a rule, or is it true in the WTO that a wrong against one is a wrong against everybody? And the answer is definitely not. That's not what we have. We didn't move during the Uruguay round. We didn't move 1 inch in that direction, right? So if you look at what happens at the end of dispute settlement, you know, you have a victorious plaintiff and a losing defendant and a bilateral contest between them, right? And there's no notion of collective security. It's not like you face retaliation from all the other WTO members when you're a losing defendant. It's bilateral. Collective security, a WTO that had a collective security concept in its sort of constitution, I think would look more like a trap than an opportunity, and I don't think anybody would want to belong to it. So as a practical matter, I don't think that, I can't imagine a WTO that precluded parking lot fights, on the one hand. Also, I would say arguably that the non-combatants are better off when the fight occurs outside. I don't see, you know, there's kind of scholars in the world who wring their hands over this, but I don't see that something like this fundamentally it's about behavior on the Chinese side that isn't sort of WTO disputable. And so, you know, and there isn't a path forward. There isn't a path forward that runs through the dispute settlement process to deal with it. There just isn't. So if it's important enough to us, then there isn't really any other place to go as a practical matter. And so effectively what we've done for the time being is entered into a status of non-application. Our relationship with China now isn't WTO based, it's bilateral. So effectively, you know, without calling it that or using that mechanism, we have the same relationship with China that we have with Cuba. Cuba's a WTO member, but our relationship isn't WTO based, it's bilateral. And it's, you know, the system recognizes that situations like that can occur. Now, normally it's supposed to happen when a country's on the way in. So somebody's exceeding and you don't want to have your relationship be WTO based, so you say, well, do non-application. The idea that non-application could break out as between two members who've previously had application, that's a little bit subversive. It's effectively what we've done. And, you know, there's a lot of downsides of what's happening, but I don't see it as necessarily destructive of the WTO. Again, I'm not one who thinks that, you know, when you know, a plaintiff loses, the WTO also loses. I don't see it that way. But my views are cranky and idiosyncratic.
Well, yeah, but they're also extremely valuable, at least to lots of people, certainly including me. To go back to subsidies just for a second, probably the big, at least time-limited negotiation they're supposed to finish this year in the WTO is the one to discipline fishing subsidies. So I just wanted to ask before we leave this topic, has the WTO set itself up for failure by putting so much emphasis on a subsidies agreement for fishing?
You know, when these ministerials are approaching, there's always a frantic effort to identify deliverables, because otherwise, if you meet and leave again, then somebody or other is going to characterize the meeting as a failure, and nobody wants that. So, you know, at one point we, you know, I think the big thing that we were trying frantically to finish up and we couldn't quite do it was trade facilitation. And so then that ministerial was, you know, very unsatisfying because there wasn't some deliverable like that. Now it's fish. You know, it's interesting that the regular WTO subsidy control rules are insufficient in this particular area. And I guess it sort of makes sense that that would be the case, but my view tends to be that I'm leery of the idea of going into a particular sector and saying, let's come up with a set of subsidy control rules that are right for that sector. Whether it's fish, whether it's farming, whether it's aerospace, I think the more we can have a unified framework, agreed principles for subsidy control, and then apply those and use those as much as possible everywhere, I think over the long haul that you wind up with something that is more durable and coherent. So that's a sort of maybe a theoretical response. In practical terms, you know, I don't know how this DG selection process is going to come out, but if it's unsatisfying at all, and if the fishing thing doesn't come together, then, you know, there's going to be a lot of hand-wringing and disappointment, and we will have had an unsuccessful ministerial. And, you know, that produces its own ripple effects. And so from that point of view, it's a little bit worrisome, but, you know, clearly they're not going to get fish done without resort to this idea of you know, deadlines and action forcing events. And, you know, I think over time, when the membership of the WTO has found that it really needed to give itself a shot in the arm of confidence, it figured out a way to do that. Did that with trade facilitation. It seems to me entirely possible that this time they won't. And that's worrisome. And, you know, the whole thing, it's tenuous. It's very tenuous. Feels tenuous to me, and that makes me sad, particularly because so many of the problems are own goals, self-inflicted wounds, and reflect short-sightedness rather than statesmanship on the part of key members at key moments.
That's yeah, I'm not too optimistic either about the fisheries agreement, but turning to the U.S., American trade policy these last 4 years has largely been driven by unilateral actions, whether it's the 232 tariffs, the 301 against China, etc. And even given the U.S. threat to withdraw from NAFTA, one could look at the USMCA, the new agreement with Canada and Mexico, as also a unilaterally driven. Your thoughts on the so-called Trump tariffs would be welcome, but there's a larger question. USTR Robert Lighthizer wrote recently that what most Americans want is a trade policy that supports the kind of society they want to live in. That way of looking at trade is I think, likely to live on, whoever wins the US election in November. So my question really is, how do you think sort of the background of that kind of thinking and these last few years will affect the evolution of US policy going forward?
So I'll get back to the so-called Trump tariffs in a minute. You know, I think Ambassador Lighthizer concept is really interesting, and it's sort of one of those kind of statements that sort of gets to the level of almost like a doctrine, you know, like the competitive liberalization doctrine that Ambassador Zellick, you know, propounded as the organizing principle for us. You know, trade policy is a pretty difficult tool to use for designing the kind of society you want to live in. It's not as potent and predictable and direct as, for example, say tax policy in that respect. So you can try to design trade policies that are compatible with some, you know, broader vision of what the kind of society you want to have, but it operates through so many intervening forces and factors and commercial decisions and, you know, behavior of people who are actually engaged in trade, or, you know, that it's anything that you might do in that area is, you know, at least a quadruple bank shot. And so that sort of principle is hard to operationalize. You know, well, let's just choose the trade policy that suits our broader design scheme for the society that we want to live in. Second point is that you know, what I think maybe we're missing at the moment is, you know, historically, you have the trade regime as it is, and then you have how it evolves over time. And as it is, it's, you know, we have a quite open and liberal trade regime, a little bit less than we did a couple of years ago, but quite open and quite liberal. The evolution of it over time is what I think about. And what causes and drives and motivates and also shapes the evolution of our trade policy over time. And in the world that we've had up to now, the starring role there was not the one that Ambassador Lighthizer suggests. The starring role was played by negotiated outcomes, right? We used rules-based trade liberalization basically as, you know, we entered into agreements, and then having done so, we had to make whatever changes needed to be made in our domestic trade regime in order to be in compliance with those newly assumed obligations. And that was what mainly motivated and shaped the evolution of our trade policy. And necessarily in a world like that, the changes that we were making were by and large liberalizing ones. Why? Because that's what our trading partners were asking for. And so if you get into a period where that's not happening, then I guess it's theoretically possible your trade regime could sit still, but that's not likely. More likely is that it will continue to evolve, but in response to something else, which is sort of, you know, some sort of domestic debate that is uninformed by what our trading partners want us to do. And the direction of the changes that will occur in that world is not necessarily toward trade liberalization. And I think that's kind of what we're experiencing. And maybe it's an elaborately complex way of referring to the bicycle theory of trade liberalization. But, you know, we're liable to do all kinds of different stuff in a world where it's autonomous, as opposed to agreement-based changes to what we're doing. The Trump tariffs, I've been watching with interest about, you know, the debate about those, and you know, some parts of the debate were over before they started. you know, I think in particular, you know, I mean, the safeguard cases produced a really, you know, full disclosure, I'm involved in them, but they produced a pretty impressive supply response in the United States. As far as I can tell, none or almost none of the calamitous downside results that were predicted by their opponents. You know, that you know, looks like score one for the Trump administration and for the Trump tariffs. 232s, you know, that's been a different story because everybody retaliated and because you know, the game there was, I guess, really to get the domestic mills up to a certain level of capacity utilization that, you know, looks to me a little bit like, you know, I mean, you can defy gravity for a while, but not forever. And so they really picked a target there that was just really ambitious. So clearly there's been beneficiaries and losers, and, you know, I don't know that there's a clear lesson from that in that sense, but I guess, you know, it's still the case today that, you know, for all of the dyspepsia over the 232s, you know, if you go out and poll on whether we should have a law that allows any sitting president to adjust imports that are threatening or harming national security, the answer is of course. Of course we should have such a law. We couldn't, nobody really can imagine a world where the president of the United States lacked the authority to adjust imports that are harming national security. Anyway, I guess maybe I'm anticipating questions you didn't ask yet, but the evolution of US trade policy was really what your question was. And the more that evolution is keyed to the things that our trading partners are asking us to do, the changes they're asking us to make, then the more the evolution of our trade policy will be in a more or less liberalizing direction, as it's been to our benefit over, you know, 60 or 70 years. And, you know, I do favor that. There's a lot of things that happen in the multilateral trading system that I criticize, but the broad drift of that, you know, the trade agreements program and you know, the reciprocal, I mean, we've benefited from that hugely. And I think that if we lose that mechanism as a driver and shaper of how our trade regime evolves through time, we'll miss it.
Okay, let's move now to maybe across the pond and talk about, just for a moment, the digital services tax issue. I believe Spain and UK have already adopted some form of a digital services tax in order to capture some of the revenue from America's big tech firms. And I also believe that the EU itself is looking at an EU-wide digital services tax. Aimed as they are as America's big technology firms, how do you think the US is likely to respond, or how do you think it should respond?
So recently we've heard that the EU's retaliation in the aircraft case is on an automatic track. I think probably the same is true about US retaliation over the digital services taxes. It's on an automatic track. I believe that will hold regardless of who the president is when the moment comes. And that we will be off and running with a really substantial new bilateral, you know, trade spat if this goes through. And, you know, I'm a trade person, I'm not a tax person, but I'm also an income tax payer. And I know that as an income tax payer, I pay a certain percentage of my net income, right? Which is basically profit. It's a profit tax. It's a tax on profits. And in a world where my net income is being fully and accurately taxed, if someone came along and said, by the way, we're also going to take a scoop out of your top line revenue number and keep that too, I wouldn't get the joke. There's no discernible logic to that at all, as far as I can tell. I mean, if they want to have an excise tax on, interacting digitally with European citizens, fine, do that, and let the companies pass it through, but apply it to everybody. The idea that you can just sort of come along and, there's a long history of negotiations and usually cooperative activities in the tax field between governments who want to be sure that income is being booked in such a way that they can all feast appropriately. They can all have an appropriate share of the net income to hit with their income tax, right? And so that there's there's tax treaties and a long history on that, and principles that governments recognize that basically control the way companies book their profits. This looks to me like an effort to just completely sweep that off to the side and say, never mind that. We don't think that historic process will work for us or will give us an appropriate a dose of tax revenue from these companies. So never mind, we're going to tax their top line revenue number. We're just going to take some of their revenues. I've never heard the other side of that story explain to me what the policy coherence could possibly be of that. Never heard it. And I'm not aware that there's one particle of sympathy anywhere in Washington, D.C. for that point of view. So this is not something that is uniquely offensive to our current president and USTR. And so I fear that it becomes a new big dispute on par size-wise with the large civil aircraft dispute. And so then we get to try to have a better trade relationship with the EU and its member states in that world, which is unfortunate. There's a lot of hand-wringing about the lack of collaboration, and it isn't going to get any easier if this thing sort of travels the path that it now seems to be traveling.
Yeah. Funny, I'm trying to stick to script here, although I can't help but want to observe that the EU's scramble for money these days is another complicating factor. In any case,
they have things to think about that we don't. They are thinking about a European project,
right?
And I am sympathetic with that. I just don't quite understand why the tech sector is one where the normal principles of net income-based taxation doesn't apply. What's so special about the tech sector that you suddenly have to start having a turnover tax rather than a profit tax? And if you're going to have a turnover tax, then hadn't you ought to sort of not have a profit tax?
Yeah.
That I understand. And there's nothing about European integration that I can see that depends on that.
Actually, I'm glad I went off script, John, because that was a helpful comment. But moving right along, and again, this may be a little bit repetitive things I've already asked, but what the hell? As you know, one of my favorite quotes is, "There are no facts about the future." But still, one is tempted to look ahead. One tries to look ahead, and so even though everybody was wringing his hands, or rather, there was a lot of turmoil caused by the Trump directions in trade policy, and yet the world has changed. So people don't think quite the way they did in the summer of 2016. And so what I'm asking you to speculate is, how do you think the next Congress is going to approach trade policy generally? What will it come up with new mechanisms? Will it try to claw back things? What's your best guess on that front?
So right now, I think that we're doing things differently than we've done. There's a discontinuity for sure with this administration in various areas, and so the question as it's framed right now for many in Congress is, what kind of plumbing do we need in the trading system, in the U.S. trade regime, in terms of the allocation of authority between the two political branches, in a world where the president is behaving this way. And so, as opposed to what are the big problems that we as a country need to solve in trade, it's more of an internal thing. Are the tools that we've put in place sensible ones, given that they can be used this way, which is not what we saw coming or what we necessarily expected. When we put this stuff in place. So maybe it's necessary for that thought process to continue because of one election outcome. And maybe there's space for different questions to float to the surface if there's a different election outcome.
Okay.
If they determine that they want to really revisit the plumbing of the U.S. Trade regime, it's a big project, and there's no sort of small ball solution that's really going to change things. You could monkey a little bit somehow with Section 232, but you wouldn't really have changed anything. There's other pathways to get to the same results when a president is determined to do that. So the only way that you could really fix the plumbing is the whole house, new pipes in the whole house, and revisit sort of everything from, IEPA to the Trading with the Enemy Act, sort of everything, and 232, and the Safeguard Law, and 301. That is something that you need an awful lot of legislative work and legislative expertise to do. And it's probably a very long-term, multiple Congress kind of a project, kind of like the 88 Trade Act was, which originally was, I think, the 84 Trade Act and then the 85 Trade Act, and then eventually they got finished with it a couple of Congresses later. And along the way, there were markups and blue ribbon panels and field hearings and all kinds of other stuff. So if it seems important to follow that path, I don't see it as something that they would be able to do quickly. And of course, if we have the same administration in place, then it will happen under circumstance that there will be a feeling of adversity around it, because it will feel like something that is specifically designed to hem in this crew or this,
Right.
President. I guess what I'm inclined to think is that it would be nice to see, and there's some signs of this, it would be nice to see the Congress and particularly sort of in the oversight function of the committees on Ways and Means and then Finance, asking bigger questions than that. Not how can we claw back more power so the president doesn't wind up in a position to proclaim tariffs all the time, but more looking outward and upward, sort of what are the problems we need to solve? What are the opportunities we need to capitalize on? And I imagine that there's going to be a lot of legislative attention paid in this next cycle to the topic of carbon control, and that is in a very significant way, among other things, a trade issue. And so, an important question would be, what can we do that's going to sort of scratch the itches that we're feeling with respect to carbon control, and also either comply with our trade obligations or else get those obligations adjusted in some intelligent way to leave policy space for what we feel we need to do. Anyway, there's a lot of things like that one could imagine Congress focusing on usefully, that are sort of target something more than just a power struggle between the political branches of the U.S. government.
Okay, we're hardly out of issues, but we are sort of running out of time.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you my last question, which is always the same to everybody, and that is there a question you wish I had asked but didn't? And if so, what is it? And what's your answer?
I suppose this can't have anything to do with the Reds or Bengals.
No, it can have anything to do with anything you want.
Oh boy!
Or if you do,
your preparation for the interview was thorough.
we can let it go where it is, because frankly you've said a lot. So if you want this one to be a wrap, we'll come back before too long and do another one.
I tell you what I'd love to do, if I may, is if it's open to me to suggest a question, then I will recommend one to you for consideration in a future interview, and you can take it on board at that point. Question
Okay.
to somebody whose answer might be valuable.
Okay. Oh, I was just, so we'll leave it then at now. At that point, we can wrap this up. And I just want to say thanks, John. I think this has really been great. I mean, I've learned a lot, and so I'm very, very grateful to you. At GBD, we also are very grateful to those who have or will join us for this virtual cup of tea. We'll do this again soon, so watch your inboxes. And for now, goodbye.